Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sangeet Choudary, who is a senior fellow at UC Berkeley and also a consultant and author of a couple books. The book you co-authored a couple of years ago was called The Platform Revolution. I had the opportunity to interview your co-author, and the latest book is called Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. Welcome, Sangeet.
Thank you, Greg. Such a pleasure to be here.
Well, look, I love this book because it really does discuss the things that I spend a lot of my time talking about in my classes and in my work with companies. In particular, right, I mean, it drills into the overlap between strategy and corporate structure and industry structure, right? So in other words, where do the points of leverage lie, right? I mean, we know that we're going to have, when there's some radical technology transformation, there's going to be an expansion of the pie, right? There's going to be all this new wealth that's created because of both cost cutting and new value creation opportunities. But the big debate is like, okay, well, who gets what piece of the pie, right? Who's going to wind up on top as the winner, right? Where are the leverage points? Where is the competitive advantage? And where will the boundaries of the firms be? And I think all the discussion about AI, certainly the discussion that I'm encountering, is kind of, I don't know, I think you use a phrase, something like fighting the last war. It's kind of like assuming that the structures will stay the same and all we're going to do is kind of automate the existing tasks or jobs. And I think your point is that that's really missing the point. That might be kind of the impact that we'll get in the short run, but in the long run, we're really radically transforming industries. And I think this is sort of building on your work on the platforms, because that was what happened with the rise of those platforms. So I guess maybe, the first place to start is, why is it, not just in this situation, but whenever there's a new technological wave, the internet and, the cloud and so forth, why is it that everybody sort of focuses on the kind of bolt-on effect and not on the much larger transformational effects?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Greg. That's the commonality between the work I did on Platform Revolution and on Reshuffle. And the questions were slightly different. Back then the questions were, who's going to win? Is it going to be digital or versus physical? Is it going to be companies that capture data versus companies that don't? So, people were looking at things more in terms of, is there a channel shift? Is there just a shift from products to services? Nobody was really thinking, or the dominant view was not looking at how does this change the entire system, right? How does this change the structure? And I think the same thing is happening with AI, even more so, because there's just so much focus on task automation. And I think this is something that the reason I believe this happens is twofold. One is that in general, we're wired to see first order effects, and a lot of us are not wired to see second and third order effects. I make the case in the book as well that when we talk about exponential growth, we talk about the idea of compounding, but we rarely talk about the idea of cascading effects. And that's really what drives exponential growth in socio-technical systems versus just exponential growth in technical performance, right? And so I believe that's one of the factors. The second factor, I believe, is that we have a very point-based relationship rather than a system-based relationship with a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the systems that we inhabit. And that is why even when we think about, for instance, AI's impact on jobs, we tend to describe our jobs in terms of the tasks that we perform rather than the role that our job performs within a larger system. So I think it's these two factors because of which we are often blinded to the larger effects of technology on the system.
Yeah, and I like the analogy you start off with, which has to do with containerization. And I did a whole podcast on containerization, and I remember reading that book, The Box, whatever
Right.
it was, 20 some odd years ago, and I've used that example as a metaphor in my classes, all the time. And even when that technology came along, I think most people failed to appreciate the transformative effect that it was going to have.
That's
Maybe
right.
you could kind of walk back and talk about that analogy and the Walmart analogy. Also, I always discuss that, Walmart case with EDI and barcodes and so forth.
Yeah, these two examples are very central to my exploration of this topic. When I first started looking at how to think about the impact of AI, um, I saw the most common analogy that everybody used was the impact of electricity and how a factory design and city design transformed around electricity. And you could say that suburbia also came up as a second order effect around the cars and highways. But the example that was really under discussed and which I felt was very interesting was the example of the container. And the reason I chose the container was because the first point that I want to make in my work is it's not the performance of AI as a new source of intelligence that matters. Uh, Even AI in its current form, even if it doesn't get to AGI, even if its intelligence does not keep progressively improving as we hope it will, even that is not sufficiently absorbed in today's systems, and today's systems are yet to transform around it. And that's where the example of the shipping container is interesting, because the container is what I would call a dumb technology when you compare it to something like AI. And the same thing goes for barcodes and Walmart. Containers and barcodes are examples of dumb technologies, and yet they transformed the system around them in dramatic ways. And the container is interesting because if you look at the effects of the container, the first order effects were that of port automation, because before the rise of the shipping container, the nature of cargo was non-standardized, and we had break bulk cargo, because of which you needed in the absence of standardized interfaces, you needed manual labor to load and unload cargo of ships. And because the interface with the cargo was not standardized, there was a high degree of unreliability in the time it would take for cargo to be loaded and unloaded off ships. And that unreliability created constraints in the surrounding system, which manifested in various forms. Because of unreliabilities, manufacturing tended to be largely local. Even if you outsource to a supplier, they would be local because you could not afford to work with somebody across the world. Manufacturing was largely vertically integrated, and the way you managed stock or the way you managed variability in supply and demand was by keeping high levels of stock. So middlemen had a lot of power. Now, the container's first order effects manifested as port automation, which was that with the unit of cargo becoming a standardized box, cranes could now move the cargo on and off the ship. So you did not need manual labor anymore. And so if we think about the parallel with AI, if we had stopped with containers and their effect as just automation, the effect would have stopped at the port. But the real effect of the container moved beyond that, and the jobs that it impacted were not just those of dock workers, but of much further flung jobs that had nothing to do with port operations. So the second order effect of the container that really happened was when trucks, trains, and ships agreed on a common standardized measurement for the container, which essentially meant that a container could move from source to destination seamlessly across different modes of transport. And the direct impact of that is that shipping became reliable across different modes of transport. And it was not just ports that were going to win now, as was the case in the past. You could be an inland economy and still be part of a global economy that was managed or connected through the container. And so that was the second order effect, the rise of intermodal
And,
transportation.
and and that's of course why all the factories in Brooklyn, disappeared, right? Because
Exactly.
their proximity to the port was no longer relevant.
That's exactly right. And the same thing happened in Liverpool and a whole range of other manufacturing hubs that were tied to the port. Absolutely. But then we had, further effects, which was essentially that manufacturing got unbundled, because when transportation became reliable, you no longer needed to work only with suppliers who were co-located and located close by. You no longer needed to manufacture everything in-house. So component-based manufacturing came up, and what that then led to was competition, not at the level of the end-to-end integrated product, but competition at the level of components, which then improved component performance, which then in turn improved product innovation as a whole. So the amount of productivity that was unlocked was way beyond what happened at the port. And eventually, globalization and the rise of global supply chains that we see all happened because of these effects of the container. So that's the reason I really like the example of how the container had second and third order effects far beyond the port. And I'll pause there before we get into Walmart and barcode. But that's really why the idea of the container and its effects is so important to our understanding of AI.
Yeah, and look, the way in which I teach this story and the Walmart story is all about, right, standardized interfaces, right? And there being a consensus that emerges. And, sometimes the consensus is top down, sometimes it's bottom up. But, in order to have this unbundling and this interoperability, you need to have some consensus. And I think part of your point is that these new AI tools actually allow for coordination in the absence of consensus. I
That's
mean,
right.
that seems to be a key distinction between these examples from the past and these newer forms of coordination.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because in the past, on one hand, we either needed somebody with significant market power to enforce standards, or we just needed consensus to get to standards. And we need standardized interfaces. We needed structured information, which essentially meant that parts of the economy or economic activity which did not have structured information could not afford to have standardized interfaces, which relied on tacit knowledge and unstructured information. All of these parts or all of these segments of economic activity could not be coordinated in a fundamentally new way. And I think that's where AI is particularly powerful, because it can, especially recent advancements in AI allow unstructured information to be ingested, a structured representation of any domain to be created on that basis, and that in turn then informs decisions and actions of all the stakeholders who are participating in that domain. So it creates a new form of coordination without consensus. You don't need to agree on the interfaces, on the data standards. You can start seeing the value by just throwing in your PDFs and your unstructured information from different parts of your enterprise. You can start making better decisions on that basis, and that then unlocks new forms of coordination as well.
But then that means that the moats have to come from somewhere else, right? So if you're Airbnb or Uber or, Salesforce or any of these platforms, right, that emerged in the last 25 years, I mean, their source of power had to do with the fact that, they were a control point, but everybody who participated in that ecosystem had to more or less, provide their piece of the pie in a way that was dictated by the platform, right?
Well, I think that model does not entirely go away. What changes is that we don't have to wait for consensus to get to the value that can be created through coordination. So I think eventually, once we create value without consensus, without waiting for everybody to agree to something, once we can start showing value to various stakeholders, better decisions, better dashboards, etc., we can then create the gravity for them to come on board, and because there's value, to start agreeing to certain terms. So eventually the mechanisms through which you govern these ecosystems don't fundamentally change. It's just that the um, nature of economic activity that can be governed in this format is now much broader. And eventually the same logic of control points still applies here. And at some point in the evolution of this coordination, even if you start without consensus, at some point you gain sufficient gravity, sufficient market power to start enforcing some of the standards. And we've seen that, I'm happy to take a few examples. We've seen that in various industries where this transition has actually worked out.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about shine. I mean, the thing is, I think that it's unclear exactly what the implications are for, vertical integration versus vertical disintegration. I mean, I forget who it was, but somebody said that the entire history of business can be
J-
described as a history of bundling and unbundling,
that's
right?
right.
Or,
Jim
vertical
Burstein.
integration and vertical disintegration, right?
Right. Right. And I strongly believe in that. The whole book is about unbundling, bundling, rebundling. And Shine is a great example of that, because Shine, the Chinese company, the Chinese fast fashion company, uh, it illustrates how this bundling, unbundling, rebundling actually happens not just in highly standardized and highly commoditized parts of the economy. I mean, we've seen that, for example, with food delivery and logistics and ride hailing. But to apply that to fashion is quite interesting, because traditionally fashion has been seen as the domain of creatives, and so it's a lot of tacit knowledge that's involved. It works on long seasonal calendars, large batch production. What Shine does, which is fundamentally different, is first it changes the nature of market sensing. Instead of designers or merchandisers flying to Tokyo and Milan, it captures all of that data about what consumers are interested in from social media. And using this data, it then essentially determines what fashion patterns are emerging. And it doesn't need to make a big bet on a large production for the next 6 months, for the next season. Because it has all of this data, it can make really small bets on small production runs, and it has an on-demand set of production facilities where it can send out these orders, get a small run done, test it in the market, and then based on data, actually invest or move in a different direction from that particular production run. And the reason this is interesting is because the uh, you know the job of a designer has been unbundled into micro tasks in this case, because the more Shine learns from all of this data, the more it is able to break down what a designer needs to do into a very small micro task. And a lot of the creative discretion and agency that a traditional designer would have in a traditional setup is no longer there. And so Shine can work with a new type of designer who doesn't even need to have that sort of pulse on the market, because the algorithm now has that pulse. So it's a unique and often polarizing case, because Shine is also not having a great impact on the environment, and there are a lot of issues around that. But it does show structurally what's possible when you sort of unbundle the very nature, the supplier order. You unbundle the production cycle. You even modularize the design that needs to be created, and how that then fundamentally restructures how manufacturing should work.
Well, maybe we can dig into this idea of modularity. I spent a lot of time talk about this in my classes, and certainly we've seen this trend for the last 25 years or so towards modularity, towards microservices,
Right.
two pizza teams, and this is happening not just sort of within companies, but also the notion that everything is available as a service. So that if you want to build a company, you can more or less source all of the different ingredients, from third-party providers. And so, what are the implications of that for the size and shape of firms? Because on the one hand, it seems like a startup entrepreneur can build a company without a big team, right? Because they can just outsource everything. But on
Right.
the other hand, we see companies like Amazon that use this, that have become absolutely the ginormous companies, right? So one would, I think, ex ante, it's unclear whether one would predict firms getting bigger or smaller as a result of this modularity.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point, because what I see, at least my observation, is that we sort of see a polarization in terms of um, uh, you know very very modular, very atomized single person, small shops coming up, and at the other end we have players who are extremely large, not because they um, capture necessarily production capacity at scale, but because they capture market-wide governance capacity at scale, and they provision market-wide infrastructure at scale. Uh, in between the two, we don't necessarily see a lot of players who are pure production players and are scaling up in the way they used to do in the industrial era. So that's been a certain level of polarization that's happened. We saw this with cloud computing, obviously, but with AI, this extends to a large part of the knowledge economy as well, because a lot of traditional knowledge work was tightly bundled to human labor and human capacity, which meant that you needed to invest in either acquiring expensive human labor or training them through expensive means. And now all of that is, or some forms of knowledge work can be performed without those commensurate investments, which then essentially means that it's possible to start companies without requiring that kind of headcount, that kind of investment anymore. At the same time, it's important to know that once these capabilities, the performance of certain forms of knowledge work, the ability to do a certain form of analysis or write a certain type of thesis, once these factors become commoditized as modular building blocks, you need to still be very clear on what basis you compete. You can't just compete by taking existing commoditized building blocks and then provisioning that to an end customer. You need to rebundle them into a solution. You need to rebundle them around a new control point, if you were to use that language. Uh, there is a lot of potential for innovation, but you need to be very clear on what's your right to play on top of these modular building blocks. And similarly, on the other side, the Amazon example is a classic case where it's not necessarily the production capacity, but the ability to control market making mechanisms on one side, whether it's Amazon Prime, the buy box. These are all ways to create a choke point on demand, or own industry-wide infrastructure on the other side, whether it's logistics, fulfillment. It's a combination of these things that then sort of sandwiches and squeezes the traditional producers in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to my grad school, I remember there were two kinds of coordination, right? There was coordination through the market and there was coordination through firms. And I think we very quickly realized that was sort of a false dichotomy, right? And that was
Right.
where the platform revolution kicked in, right? And that a lot of these firms their competitive advantage comes from their ability to construct markets,
Right.
right? And to coordinate across all of these different enterprises.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. That's a certain narrative that we did not use in the original book. We talked about how anybody now has the ability to unlock markets. We're actually, what we've seen ever since then is it's not just the ability to unlock market activity, but the ability to enclose what was traditionally non-private market mechanisms, and then enclose them towards your benefit. And that's, I think, what's really critical about what drives power today. You have the ability to unlock value by investing in algorithms, but then you have the ability to capture value by capturing and enclosing complementary data that traditionally would not have been a private good, and so or privately captured by private enterprises. And so that's really what has driven what we today see as the platform economy.
Yeah. Now you also talk about kind of tools versus machines and tools versus solutions. And I was wondering if you can dig into this because this sort of gets to the heart of the big debate right now over AI, like who is going to ultimately make money here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are all these startups here in Silicon Valley that people are describing as kind of LLM wrappers, right? They are fueled by these LLMs on the back end, but they're trying to sort of dominate a vertical or dominate a particular workflow. And it seems like the bargaining power is going back and forth. As you probably saw, OpenAI just released a new kind of toolbox,
Right.
right? Which is meant
Yeah.
to replace a lot of these things. And we hear about how people are getting rid of some of these specialized solutions and just going directly to the source and designing everything from scratch from the LLMs themselves. So I was wondering if you could tell us, how do those different kind of
Yeah.
formulations help us understand what's going on?
Yeah, I make two distinctions in the book. One is the idea of using AI as a tool versus using AI as an engine, and the second is the distinction between two players in the value chain, or two types of players in the value chain: the tool providers and the solution providers. And let me just get into the first one first. So, the idea of using AI as a tool versus AI as an engine is that a tool is typically something that you bolt onto your existing workflows. You pick a tool from the toolbox, and it helps you, speed up a task, perform it faster, better, cheaper. But if you're really using an engine, you're constantly thinking about how to redesign your entire workflow and your entire organization, your business model around the capabilities of the engine. And a very, intuitive example is how F1 racing works. The car is actually built around the capabilities of the engine. You don't have those two working separately. In fact, even the pit operations are built around the capabilities of an engine. So it goes all the way. In order to squeeze out the performance of the engine, you need to optimize every layer of value around the capabilities of the engine. And I think this distinction is important because today most companies see AI as a tool. They are not thinking about how do I reimagine my workflow, my business model, my organizational capabilities in order to compete around the new capabilities of this engine. They're still thinking about what are the tasks I perform, at what
Yeah.
cost do I perform them, and how can I do them cheaper, better, faster with AI. And an
Okay, so wait,
example
so
of,
this would,
yeah,
so let me just, so this, I mean, this stuff we teach, right? So I have a whole course on agentic AI. And in that course, right, the first step is mapping out your workflow, figuring out exactly what it is that you're doing,
right,
taking the tacit knowledge about the workflow, making it explicit and saying, oh, here's what I'm doing. I'm doing a data retrieval, and then I'm doing a data analysis, and then I'm, spitting out a recommendation, and then, converting a sale. And once I've done that, then I can say, oh, let's, create an agent that automates this. Let's create an agent that automates that. Let's create an agent that automates that.
right.
And that would be the basically tool usage, right?
That's right. Absolutely. Yes. And, just to speak to that point, the key distinction, I believe, is that we often see a workflow as a sequence of tasks. We don't necessarily ask what are the constraints and assumptions on the basis of which that workflow is created. And does, with AI coming in, do those constraints and assumptions still hold true? Because that's really what we should be thinking about when we look at a workflow. And, going back to the idea of tools versus engines, a great example to kind of bring that distinction is what happened in social networking when TikTok came up. So before the rise of TikTok, the social networks that were dominant, Instagram, YouTube, etc., were all built around the logic of the social graph. And because it's so difficult to solve the chicken and egg problem of if nobody follows you, you won't be posting, and hence your social graph never gets started up. Uh, Wall Street had kind of declared these companies winners, and there was no way for a new social network to come up. And what TikTok did was it essentially restructured the idea of a social network around the capabilities of AI. And essentially, instead of relying on the idea of a social graph, it created more of a behavior graph where really small, sub 60-second videos could be created easily by creators, and consumers could constantly swipe them, pause, replay every single action that consumers performed. And because this was mobile native, all of those actions could be captured. That helped populate the behavior graph, and that in turn helped populate the user's feed. And eventually, that then helped create the social graph because users would eventually follow creators whose content they were seeing and resonating with. And all the traditional social networks had access to the same AI, but they used that AI to improve recommendations within the social graph. They did not use it to rethink how the social network should be structured. And so that's the key idea that, when you think about AI as an engine, you reimagine the structure of your business around its capabilities, versus when you see it as a tool, you take the existing structure that already existed and you try to speed up things within that structure. And today, eventually, with TikTok getting to scale, everybody now has moved to the so-called open graph model. It's no longer just the social graph. So that's an example of, AI as a tool versus AI as an engine. And the other,
Well, I like going back even further in time. I like this example you offered up of the typists, right? And how, we didn't just sort of create sort of faster typists when we introduced word processing, right?
that's right. Yeah, and that's exactly, speaks to the point that I made about workflows, because uh, the idea of of a job as being composed of tasks kind of comes through because when we think of a typist, we assume that their job is about typing because it's in the name, right? And we assume that jobs are about tasks. But when the word processor came in, the word processor was not automating typing, it was augmenting humans. So a typist would naturally have thought of, using today's parlance of automation versus augmentation. A typist, you could not have faulted a typist for believing that a word processor would make them a faster typist. But what really enabled the job of a typist, or what the reason the job existed in the first place, was not the task of typing, but because of the constraint of expensive editing that existed before the rise of the word processor. Because previous tools like typewriters and so on were involved very expensive editing, and hence accuracy in typing was very valuable. When that constraint went away, the value of that accuracy in typing went down, and hence now anybody could type. And that's why, the task of typing never went away, it never got automated, but the job of the typist went away. And that's, again, something that when we think about agentic AI today, those are the issues that we should be thinking about. What is that constraint that could go away because of AI, and how would you then redesign your workflow on that basis?
Yeah, well, getting back to, so the idea of an engine, what would it mean? I'm a big fan of the electricity analogy that, Eric Brynjolfsson makes, and the idea that you have to kind of blow up the entire factory, right?
Right.
Get rid of all the belts, get rid of all the gears, get rid of all the shafts, start putting in the dynamos and so forth. And so for a typical business manager or strategist within a company, where do they start? I mean, how do they reconceptualize their business when they think of AI as an engine?
Yeah. Um, you know the the framework that I use to kind of clarify this is that the impact of AI does not play out only at the level of individual tasks. It plays out at every level of value creation. So the tasks which sit inside workflows, which are organized through larger organizational mechanisms, which then essentially allow a firm to compete in an ecosystem. And the way I would start looking at this is, start by asking yourself, is the basis of competition changing because of AI? How is the basis of competition changing? What were assumptions on the basis of which we competed? What were scarcities that enabled us to capture value? And how do those things change going forward? With that view in place, the next question I would then ask is, in order to work with the new basis of competition, what capabilities should I be setting up within my firm? What should I, continue investing in? Which capabilities should I uh, uh, evolve further? Which ones should I abandon? Which new capabilities should I acquire? And so, really having that view on having that view of dynamic capabilities, that you can't be stuck with your previous capability stack. You have to keep evolving that on the basis of the new basis of competition is very central to this. And that then should translate into how should the organization organize in order to compete using these capabilities. What are the new workflows? What are the new structures? Does the decision making structure change, for instance? And just as a simple example, before the rise of mobile phones and mobile apps, yes, so to really think about how you need to transform, and how you need to reimagine your business model around this new dynamo, if you will, it's key to start thinking about the fact that AI, uh, the impact of AI does not play out only at the level of tasks. Tasks sit inside workflows, so workflows get transformed. Workflows are organized through organizational mechanisms, so new organizational systems will have to come in place. And organizations essentially compete in an ecosystem. They help a firm compete in an ecosystem. And so the starting point would be to start by asking ourselves, with AI coming in and with other forces at play, how is the basis of competition shifting? What was the basis on which firms previously competed? What was our basis of differentiation and competition? And does that change? Do some of those assumptions no longer hold true? And on that basis, if we can lay out some clear hypotheses and heuristics on what's changing in terms of the basis of competition, what does that mean in terms of the capabilities we need to have in place? What capabilities should we evolve? Which ones should we abandon? Which new capabilities should we acquire? And which of these are critical to own internally versus allow to blossom externally? All of those factors start becoming need to come into question and need to be evaluated. And with the new capability stack in place, how do you then think about value creation in your organization? What does the new workflow look like? What are the new constraints around which these workflows should be structured if AI takes away some of the older constraints? So it's really about thinking about these changes at every level of value creation. If we instead start by looking at how can I speed up my tasks so that my workflows start becoming faster, we'll never ever get to the point where we reimagine our business around the new basis of competition. So I believe that we need to have the simultaneous view on what's changing in terms of how firms compete, but also what new capabilities are becoming more valuable as a result, and which existing capabilities are losing value, and constantly work across these two levels to really transform.
Right. And so to what extent does competitive advantage lie in, right, understanding the customer and having customer data, right, across a bunch of different customers? I mean, that seems to have always been a place where you could establish a moat, right? You have, I mean, you think about General Electric, right? You think about John Deere, you think about all these companies, platform companies that have, put sensors and have been capturing all this,
Right.
consumer data and behavioral data and usage data. I mean, is that going to continue to be sort of the most important thing?
I think there are two ways to look at it. So the on the first point, customer data and managing the customer relationship, or managing the right to serve the customer. You don't even necessarily have to be on the customer interface, as long as you have the right to serve the customer, and as long as you are able to influence others' rights to serve the customer, which is what a lot of platform companies do today. That will continue to be important. And in fact, one of the points that I make, which again polarizes people to some extent, is that AI creates new opportunities to set up new control points in the customer journey, because you can help customers make better decisions. You can, through that, gain greater leverage over their decisions as they move forward. Of course, there are issues around who owns the data and who is the AI serving as a result, and that's what really causes polarized opinions on this. But to the extent that we can solve that problem, I believe that AI offers new opportunities to create control points in the customer journey and gain competitive advantage on that basis. But at the same time, I believe that over the past 15 years, since the time when I first started looking at these issues, we've seen a shift in the impact of digital technologies on competitive advantage across the value chain, starting from the customer and working backwards. So in the early 2010s, if you will, most of the platform story was around market aggregation and ownership of market mechanisms, whether it was Facebook social graph or Airbnb's trust rating system. It was all demand side scale and ownership of market mechanisms. In the mid 2010s, we started seeing a lot of factors which led to the rise of modularity across the value chain. As processes became more modular, microservices came in, API-based collaboration came in. And so we started seeing the rise of new standards, regulation towards open banking and open healthcare, capabilities to organize fragmented APIs coming in. And so new control points started emerging at that in those middle tiers of the value chain. And I think those things become increasingly important, because AI, as I mentioned, modularizes capabilities which were traditionally seen as based on tacit knowledge. So whenever you have new forms of modularity coming in across the value chain, you have the opportunity to create new standards and new forms of control, depending on which of those are open versus proprietary. But the third thing that I believe is increasingly happening, and where I also focus a lot of my work going forward, is that I believe that the nature of inputs into the value chain is fundamentally changing as well, and AI is one of those inputs. Traditionally, inputs have been commodity inputs. Whether we think of electricity, whether we think of materials and minerals, but today, if you look at energy as an input, if you look at bioplastics, with advancements in synthetic biology, advancements in material science, advancements in chemistry and energy, and then AI, the rate of innovation in the underlying inputs is often much higher than innovation at the product levels. And I think that's something that's going to be very interesting as well, because that will create a unique tension, which I call the tool provider versus the solution provider tension, which is fundamentally a tension between the provider of the input and the provider of the solution using the input. So these are three different forms of new control points that I believe are important to look at.
Yeah, I mean, let's dig into that because if you own the customer, right? I mean, that's incredibly powerful. And so I think now the location of where that control is kind of in play, right? So right now, if I want to book an Airbnb, I go to Airbnb, and if I want to, book a flight, I'll go to United. But because these new companies could emerge that would sort of, manage the entire vacation journey, and I say,
Right.
look, just string together my 1 week vacation, then they're going to go to Airbnb and find the house, and they're going to go to United and find the flight based on what they know about me and my preferences and so forth. Does that mean then that the leverage point will migrate kind of away from Airbnb and towards sort of a more general customer journey navigation tool? Or will, Airbnb say, I need to become that, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to lose some of my leverage.
Yeah, I think those are interesting battles that haven't yet been fully decided. There's going to be, tensions in both ways. There's going to be a pull from anybody who can gain the right to be the assistant to the customer across a fragmented journey, and then there's going to be, pull away from the players who are actually serving into that journey. And we've seen this in certain ways in the past, which kind of give us some clues, because when Netflix moved from serving DVDs to streaming, it realized that its core capability of inventory management did not translate into streaming. And streaming was, a place where you can have different forms of inputs into streaming. On the one hand, Netflix is a customer of Amazon Web Services, but that, it's a commodity input, so it doesn't have pricing power. Whereas if it's a customer of studios, then if the studios provide unique content that helps Netflix retain users, then
Yeah,
the studios have what is called wholesale transfer pricing power. Every time the customer wants to pay more, the studios can renegotiate. And so Netflix is squeezed in the middle, which is why it ended up moving into content creation
yeah,
to avoid that stranglehold. So I think we'll see similar issues over here, because this idea of solution providers serving the customer versus input providers and tool providers underneath, um, we'll see similar tensions emerging again. And there will be both types of responses. You will either have one party moving backward, so think of Netflix going back into content production, or Amazon investing in Kiva robots because
yeah. Or,
warehousing is
or
just
Uber getting into maps and payment
exactly.
processing and so forth to reduce their reliance on say, Google Maps or on Stripe or something, right?
That's absolutely right. And similarly, in certain cases, we might, if the end customer value pool is valuable enough, you might see the tool providers coming to the front, like Google eventually is doing through Waymo, and so
Yeah.
those tensions are bound to happen.
So how is that going to play out now with these LLMs, right? So, I mean, feel free to speculate, but it seems like, if you have, say, OpenAI inside of everything, then, they're going to be in the position of, say, Google Maps, right? They're going to be the ones that have the ability to extract all the value
Right,
from these wrappers and from these specific providers of solutions,
right,
right?
right. Right. And I think, we have some clues from past revolutions in terms of how some of this plays out. So even if we think of OpenAI, which now is, creating the effective version of an App Store operating system on top of its models, um, what I would eventually expect will happen over here is that, given that OpenAI owns the model layer, apps that come on top of it can drive customer usage, and eventually can give OpenAI visibility into into what use cases are playing out. Where this is different from mobile phones, for instance, is that OpenAI has a different, or with AI, we have a different ability to rebundle workflows on top of these applications. So in mobile, in the mobile phone example, you keep switching between apps. You don't rebundle a
Yeah.
workflow. The only example of a rebundled workflow is WeChat, which essentially moved the app into the chat interface. I expect something like that to happen over here, where eventually the more it can learn from how these apps are being used, the more it can create layers on top which give it control over cross app workflow, so that eventually the app execution itself becomes commoditized. And that's really what happened with WeChat in China. So I expect a similar trajectory.
Well, and we're seeing that with the emergence of these new browsers, right? So Perplexity now has a
Right.
browser that will open your 27 tabs and manage across all of these different tabs with some simple instructions. I mean, that seems like it's going to give them an enormous amount of power as the gatekeeper or the bottleneck, right?
Yeah, I think the browser war in particular is quite interesting, because it's actually something I mentioned as a 27 tab problem in my book. But at that point, this whole idea of AI powered browsers had not really come up. So that's another way to solve that problem, which is you solve it within the browser. And um, I think that again, the ability with AI to rebundle workflows across fragmented execution points is really the unique advantage over here. This is something we never had with SaaS and cloud computing. If you think of Salesforce's history, it's always tried to capture or acquire every single software along the customer journey, but it never stitched together the workflow, which essentially did not allow it to gain the share of customer wallet that was hoping to gain with it. But with AI, that becomes possible, and it becomes especially possible for a company like Perplexity or OpenAI, which is quote unquote AI native, to rebundle that workflow on top.
Yeah, and so maybe you could talk a bit. I mean, you used a couple examples that aren't necessarily involving AI, right? So you talk about Best Buy, and you talk about Sephora, and how they were able to respond to these changes by really dialing into, right, the customer journey. And I mean, is that a kind of a roadmap potentially for enterprises?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some inspiration that we can take from there, because there's some similarities and there are a lot of differences as well. But in terms of inspiration, what we can take from companies that have succeeded in capturing customer attention in a highly competitive space is their ability to solve customer decisions at key points. And
And this really involves establishing customer trust, right? Because if the customer thinks that this um, aggregator, right,
yeah,
or this kind of, you know, I don't know, broker, right, is making decisions that are in their own interest and not the customer's interest, then they lose their credibility, right?
right. Right, absolutely. And I think the Best Buy example is really interesting over here, because, Best Buy and Circuit City had very different outcomes in the 2010s or late 2000s, after the rise of Amazon as a competitor. And what Best Buy, really leveraged was this insight that consumer electronics are not one monolithic purchase decision. Buying a USB port converter is very different from buying a smart home system. So there are different levels of decision involved. And while online players like Amazon were really good at selling the commodity electronics, they were not so good at selling electronics which required much more decision, much more knowledge and experience with using the product. And that's where
Right. So you go to Amazon after you already have kind of figured out what it is that you need or want, right?
Right, absolutely. And it's also different categories. So you typically go to Amazon for the accessories. You may not go to Amazon for a completely new product category that you've never gone ahead and looked at. And that, to some extent, it was, Best Buy saw that that's what was happening. It was called showrooming. People were trying to gain that knowledge by visiting stores, but then buying on Amazon. So Best Buy essentially converted those people in store by investing in the Geek Squad and by helping drive, helping them with their key decision. It was able to convert footfalls that were anyway coming in, and it was able to convert them into customers. And the additional advantage that happened was that because Best Buy was helping them with the complex decisions, it was also able to upsell the relatively commoditized accessories for which they would have anyway gone to Amazon. But because Best Buy could now sell a bundle that if you're buying this, why don't you also buy 5 other things that work with it? That actually worked in its favor as well. So the key point over here is that what helped Best Buy gain a foothold in the customer journey was establishing itself as the trusted advisor when it came to buying complex electronics. And that then, with that foothold in place, it allowed Best Buy to kind of extend across that customer journey. There was a very specific reason they went into smart home at that point in time, because there were a lot of connected products that were coming in. It was an opportunity to gain greater share of customer wallet if you could help set up the smart home hub for them. And because the consumer electronics providers were themselves not doing it, Best Buy kind of leveraged that as well. So it's an interesting story of how, an industry that had been written off, they've identified certain places through which they could gain that leverage.
Well, it's interesting. I was looking to buy a new refrigerator yesterday, and I went to ChatGPT. I didn't go to Home Depot, right? I mean, Home Depot, you would think, would be the place to go, and you should be
Right.
able to query them and say, okay, look, here's what I'm looking for, but they haven't done this. Whereas ChatGPT has, right,
That's right.
serves up some good solutions,
Yeah.
right? So why haven't companies like Home Depot, let's say, who have all of this data on all the different brands and so forth? I mean, what's preventing them? Because presumably they could just sort of tap into the AI engines that exist already and then marry that with the knowledge, the specific knowledge that they have. What's standing in their way?
Yeah, I think, and this is something that we've seen with the previous generation of platforms as well. Um, the right to serve the customer journey as, this starts with the right to serve the customer journey as an unbiased player who is not, if Home Depot were to do it, they would be biased towards their own electronics. And so they're automatically constrained in terms of how they can serve the customer. If they had to serve the customer independent of that across the larger, sphere, so that they, if the customers, if the best match was with a competitor, they would end up serving that as well to the customer, then they would have to really hive off and keep that as a separate initiative outside. And so the key, I think, distinction is that it's a lot easier for a player who does not have those production side incentives to then serve the customer independent of that. But then once they have access to the customer and once they have a stranglehold, we've repeatedly seen that then they start getting production side incentives and pace, and they start favoring what works best for them rather than for the customer.
Yeah. Well, you talk about Alexa, right? And we normally think of companies like Amazon as always being at the forefront of these trends, but it seems like in this case, they kind of blew it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Alexa is an interesting example because for the last 7 years, leading up to 2022, I read many books that have talked about how Alexa is the next big thing and is the perfect example of an ecosystem orchestrator and so on. But I think what a lot of them missed, which you would not miss if you were actually a user of Alexa, was that even though on paper Alexa seems to be doing all the right things, which is that it has the right to be the customer interface. That's great. It's an always-on customer interface. It's capturing data about the customer. On the other hand, it's getting all the partners in place, which you should be doing as an ecosystem orchestrator. But it failed to create a coordination mechanism, because if you actually used Alexa as a customer and if you try to order pizza, it's not as at least before 2022, it was not a seamless experience. You had to
Right.
order pizza, then it would ask you to open up Domino's app, skill over there. Then you would speak with the Domino's skill, and then that would, in order to use it further, you had to go and log into the app. So it was a very fragmented customer journey. It was quite the opposite of a seamless customer experience that Amazon had online. And so even though Amazon on paper had a very strong customer side, demand side control point, it did not have a strong partner side, production side control point through which it could coordinate, across different players. And I think that's what really broke down for them. And to a large extent, it was because of the capabilities of the AI that they were using, which was not built on today's LLMs. And now with LLMs coming in, all those problems are very well solved problems. But in 2022, when Amazon, fired that whole team, it was because they were stuck to an old technology.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, in professional services and in other kind of knowledge work, I mean, the way in which humans have typically carved out a position that earned significant amounts of money was to, be the orchestrator, be the coordinator,
That's
have
right.
some specialized knowledge and so forth. And it seems like a lot of that specialized knowledge is being commodified and the coordination capacities are being more or less replicated by these new tools and maybe even improved upon. So what then does it should individuals, right? Highly educated people like you and me. I mean, what do we need to focus on? What kinds of positions can we carve out that will give us some leverage, some bargaining power, so that we're not just earning replacement wages?
Yeah, there are quite a few points that I make in the book that I'll try to string together here because all of them, are things that we should be thinking about. The first is something that I already spoke about, which is let's as a starting point we need to stop thinking of our jobs as a bundle of tasks that is contained within them, and start thinking of it in terms of what is the problem this job solves in the current competitive landscape, what is the constraint it solves in the current organizational system, why is this job required. And with AI coming in, are some of those assumptions going away? One of the assumptions, for instance, is just the fact that access to certain forms of knowledge work was very scarce. So now that scarcity goes away. How do I then think about what's the new constraint? And so towards that, I talk about there are typically three forms of constraints that I've seen. There are constraints that come from scarcity. And so in order to manage constraints around scarcity, organizations structure their talent strategies, etc., around that. With AI, the first thing is the constraint around scarcity of certain skills goes down. One response to that is something that people often say: do what AI can't yet do. And look for tasks that AI can't accomplish. And I think that again misses the point because AI is constantly, improving. It's getting funded in ways that what it can't do today may not be the same tomorrow. And so that's a losing game. Instead, we should be really looking at what else is scarce in the system, what other constraints exist. So there are two other forms of constraints I talk about. One is that in any business scenario, risk is always a constraint. It's very easy to generate answers. That's what ChatGPT does. But eventually, as a professional services provider, you need to assume the risk associated with applying those answers. And an example to kind of illustrate the importance of risk is the example of the anesthesiologist who is still paid very high wage, even though most of his tasks or their tasks are the individual tasks are managed by machines. They have been automated. But the ability to manage risk associated with the patient's condition in the operating theater in real time is what gives them the ability to charge a premium. So managing the risk constraint is very important. Managing the risk constraint may also mean that you should start seeing your job not just as executing and getting the work done, but co-owning some of the outcome to
Yeah.
whoever your stakeholder is. As a company, that might mean an outcome-based business model, but even as an individual, it means getting more involved in sharing that risk. And then the third piece that I'll call out, uh, uh, which always shifts as a constraint, is to your point, even if certain forms of human coordination can be performed agentically and with AI now, new forms of coordination constraints will emerge. We see that with every time technology is deployed, just because human systems and organizational systems are so messy, technology is not evenly deployed, and that creates new coordination constraints. And players who actively spot those coordination constraints and try to manage them will be in a strong position. And I'll just make a final point over here to kind of bring all of this home. Uh, when we think about how to operate when our traditional skills start getting commoditized, a very compelling example that I associate with the stat of the role of a magician and how that has changed since the rise of the internet, because the magician is a classic example of a skill that magic is a skill that requires a lot of effort and a lot of investment on the part of the magician, and you are able to capture the skill premium associated with that skill only as long as the trick is a secret. But with the rise of the internet, we had this whole range of YouTubers coming in and deconstructing these tricks, and the magicians that really thrived post that as of today are the ones who reimagined where magic was. It was not just in the trick. They rebundled the existing old tricks instead of trying to learn tricks that had not yet been deconstructed. The idea of do what AI can't do. Instead of doing that, they took the same old tricks, rebundled them into new stories, new presentations, and then created greater spectacle around that. So the sense of wonder that the trick used to create now is created by the largest spectacle. And I think, that's the key idea I would just throw out, that if you really want to think more expansively about your job, think about what's the new bundle, what's the larger bundle when your core skills get commoditized.
Yeah, and you talked about the sommeliers, and you didn't talk about professors, but I think, that's kind of what we have to do going forward is, we can't just simply transmit information. We have to be sort of storytellers and, narrative providers and kind of model animators to some degree, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, storytelling and narrative in general is such an important skill today, because we are sort of in an age where we are information rich, but attention poor. And the way to kind of harness that attention is to really have compelling storytelling and narratives bridging that gap.
Well, there's a lot of great stories in this book, and certainly ones
Thank you.
that I am going to borrow and import into my teaching. And so, Sangeet, thanks so much for joining me. This new book is called Reshuffle, and it really makes you rethink how AI is going to impact business going forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Craig. It was such a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.